paganism should not be a ton of academic work. It never should have gotten to this point. But unfortunately, that's where we are, and we have to be the generation to get past it so future generations don't have to be doing this.
This is Hyperborean Radio Uncensored. I'm Celtic God, and across from me is the Lord Keeper.
Hello, everybody.
And we're going to talk to you today. With you, with each other. We're going to do some talking today.
We're going to be talkers. And first things first, thank you to everyone that supports us on Patreon, Buy Me a Coffee, or through other means. We really appreciate it, and it lets us know that you do appreciate our work. And actually, today we're going to talk about something that's a bit of near and dear to my heart, which is research. And how most people, when they get into ethnic ways, especially it seems our audience,
tripping over the word because we're trying to fix our own vernacular.
Yes. Is you've probably realized by now, and you've probably had this kind of emotional reaction when you're reading a lot of
let me rescue you.
Thank you.
I'm going to rescue you. Most people, when they first start trying to pursue an ethnic path, one of the first things that you do is you start cracking open books, surfing the web, etc., etc. And then you start hitting reading lists. And you're here because, most likely, because you've noticed a lot of these reading lists, something seems wrong. It's off. You might not know what it is, but you know that something isn't right. Congratulations, you're correct.
Yes, because part of what spawned the desire to talk about this is I finally cracked open a very common book that's usually on most people's recommended lists, which is The Myths of the Norsemen.
Oh, I tried reading it. I tried.
I was going down the list and just reading sections, and I'm like, so this is where everybody's getting that problem. They'll make statements that have no backing. They will, and it's like a laundry list. It was almost like if someone listed a lot of my major issues with where people are, how they write research, how they think, where they're getting their ideas. I'm like, so this is where it's all coming from.
Yeah, and I've had that that book quoted to me quite a bit, and I just explained to people it was written by universalists that didn't know what the fuck they was talking about. But mostly what we're going to be talking about is the red flags. You might not realize that the red flags, but they are. So we're going to talk about some of the warning things. Like, is the thing written? Are these opinion based? And you can tell. I mean, it's like the news. Most news is opinion based. So is it opinion based? Is there quotes? Because a lot of books they'll put in, like the little segments of stories or whatnot. I think even the Myths of the Norsemen has quotes in there from various writings, right?
Yes.
Except for they're very cherry picked, much like arguing with a Christian, for instance, and they'll use one verse. I can't think of a book. Okay, I'm going to make one up. Genesis 52:16 says, "Thou shalt tieth thy shoe twice," and it doesn't. They just kind of made it up, or so seriously paraphrased it that it has nothing to do with what it actually says. Or if they manage to get it actually correct, because a lot of these will use actual quotes, so the quote is correct, but it's taken out of context because they don't use the whole. And they do this so that they can present their weird-ass ideas in a weird-ass way and make it make sense. I believe it's called rationalization.
Yes, and here's the thing is it's this issue, this monotheist or universalist writing about paganism and sort of almost like Russian doll collapsing each of the gods in on each other. This is nothing new. This isn't unique to any pantheon. They've done it with all the others.
Well, some of the oldest ones was Greek.
Oh, yeah. They used to do it where all the gods were Zeus, all the goddesses were Hera, and then they were
and
the male.
Zeus was actually God.
Yes, and Hera was just the feminine aspect of God. And
I
then
think Heracles took the place of Oily Josh.
Yeah, it's something they've done time and time again, and sometimes it's done intentionally. There's actually
most of the time I think it was done intentionally, and they just try to disguise that.
Yes. Like, there's actually a famous Irish storyteller. We won't name drop him because we're not fans of doing that. But he actually admits that he will find more pagan stories and make them more Christian. Like, spin it so, like, the little folk are evil. Or things of that nature. And it's because he's Christian. So he doesn't really want to spread around pagan folklore, but he also doesn't want the folklore to die.
Right. Well,
so he's kind of taking that middle path.
Yeah. And he's open about it, but he doesn't bang that drum really hard because he doesn't want... Here's the truth of it. He doesn't want people to know, but I'm not a liar. So I have to let people know that I'm doing this. So it'll be like 3 or 4 seconds out of, a 40-minute video. So you have to actually be paying attention, otherwise you miss it.
Yes. Or another good example is Jacob Grimm. I actually have a lot of respect for the Grimm brothers. However, they were quite literally almost charged with heresy.
Several times.
And if you read Teutonic mythology, which is...
it's another one that's quoted at me a lot.
Yes, it has a lot of issues. But it's clear that the Grimm brothers, especially Jacob Grimm...
They tried,
but they knew about a lot more folklore involving the gods than they included in Grimm's fairy tales.
In the official writings, you can only find them in their notes. But here's the thing, is the approach that they took. It was monotheist.
Oh, yeah, through and through.
And they openly admit it.
Oh, yeah. Well, it's the same with people that wrote down the Greek mythology, people that wrote down the Finnish mythology.
Fucking Guido, he starts his book with, I am a monotheist.
I am a monotheist, and we're actually talking about the one true white God, and polytheism is just a way to control the masses or something, which is actually the inverse, because every empire has always tended towards monotheism because it's actually easier to control people if they only have the one God.
Right. Which means that they might actually be putting out real stories. Probably are, if there's actually any stories at all. They might be putting out real stories. But their analysis, I guess, because all these books, they have the analyses of the stories, is run through that lens of a monotheist, of they start off with the premise, like they might not even be a monotheist. I believe in many gods, and they usually say this like right in the beginning parts of their books and writings. I am not a monotheist. I believe in many gods. However, as the Aztecs feared their gods, or whatever the nonsense is, because I don't know if Aztecs feared their gods. Anyways, as Aztecs feared their gods, I believe all men truly fear their gods, as reflected in Christianity and the phrase, fear thy God. That means everything that they're going to write is run through that lens of fearing the gods. This is something, when you look at our cultures, the Hyperborean cultures, the Hyperborean history, you get back far enough, we didn't fear our gods.
Well, and that's actually something I've come across a lot, is the idea of
let me prove that really quick. We didn't fear our gods because, to paraphrase, what does the Celtic warrior fear? The sky falling upon his head. Nothing else. He didn't fear his gods.
No, there was no point. And this is true across the mythologies of Europe and Hyperborea. But it's really pronounced still in the Celtic, which is the gods are an extended family. Mm-hmm. They're relatives. They're divine ancestors. They're ascended ancestors. It's a whole thing. They don't fear them because they're family. And like every good Celtic family, 95% of them are completely insane. Am I wrong?
You can't see me staring at him. Of course we're fucking nuts.
I mean it with all love.
You can't have a Celtic wedding without 3 people dying. And most likely a war starting.
Well, the reality is all of our people are nuts, especially when you try to compare us to all the other groups.
Yeah.
But the Celts never tried to tone it down.
It's a special brand.
Yeah, well, it's basically you just never toned it down.
Yeah.
I mean, they used to comment on that the Celts are very wild. They did the same thing with several other groups, but it's kind of like the Celts are the most obvious, and then the rest of them are kind of speckled through Europe.
But, yeah, it's hard to do research without coming across opinions, because we've read a lot of stuff written by, I don't know, JP PP guy. Mm-hmm. I don't know. It's early in the morning, man. I'm struggling. I'm firing only on most of the neurons at the moment, not all of them. But we've read a lot of books to get stories and lore and historic perspectives, so on and so forth. Most of them will have opinion in them. Fortunately, the authors typically, right in the beginning, in the foreword, not the acknowledgement, but in the foreword, the author's pre-notes, will say exactly what lenses are running the information through. The further off base they are, the less that you take their opinions into consideration. There's been entire books where I read the foreword and maybe some of the intro, and then I just scan through it looking for, because they're always highlighted somehow, the actual historic texts. Read the historic text and keep flipping, ignore their opinions, their analysis of it, because they're monotheists. They believe that the people feared the gods, that we were cannibals and murderous monsters.
Well, it's actually another thing that people will bring up is not just the gods, but the idea that the pagans feared their dead. Mm-hmm. And that's why they had all of these traditions. Like the same traditions we have, just kind of slightly different for the time period, for, honoring our dead, mm-hmm. burying our dead, laying our dead to rest. And then they think that we feared them, and then Christianity came, and that's when we stopped fearing our dead. Except Christianity doesn't have the element of not fearing the dead. It's this, people want how everything is today to be representative of Christianity and not be a holdover from paganism, so they write from that perspective that everything was different before the coming of Christianity, so therefore everything we have now is the result of it.
And you can't make the mistake that everything has always been as it is now. So both of these mistakes are really commonly made. And one of the things pagans feared their dead. Well, how do you explain those bodies that they found? It was a grave, not a single grave. There was multiple bodies like this that were buried, tied into a fetal position inside of a bag with a rock in their mouth. Obviously, they were afraid of the bodies rising up and then eating them, and it's proof that they thought vampires or zombies or something was real. Well, not necessarily. Let's try another route. This might not have been an honored graveyard, because we bury the dead. It's just what we do. Perhaps these were not good people. Or maybe it was representative of something from, I don't know, when we're in the womb. There are a lot of possibilities, and I'm not going to pretend to know what it was.
Well, it's like, let's go with something more recent. The graves with, cages on top of them, or a weighted top.
Oh, yeah. Clearly monsters that couldn't escape the grave.
Yes, they were scared they were going to rise up and be zombies, basically. No, it was to stop grave robbers. Yeah. I think it's even admitted that's why they were usually graves of
if you look
people.
At historic writings of the time, they will mention that's why they had to put a cage over top of the grave. Sometimes it was almost always, to prevent grave robbing. But sometimes the grave it'd be written, this grave has been robbed 3 times. We're tired of it, and so we're just putting a cage over top of it, so it's near impossible to rob this grave. It's not that they can't. It's just they're going to make a lot of noise doing it.
Well, and part of the easiest way to sort of parse out the monotheistic idea of things from the more pagan idea is the fact that if you understand universalism and you understand Christianity, and then you can filter that through while you're reading. Because I've actually said this many times before. When you're researching, it's not downloading, it's debating. Mm-hmm. Especially when you're dealing with opinion. Because I'm not going to lie, there are some books I've read that are 90% opinion and 10% mentions of lore or history or stuff like that.
Sometimes less.
Sometimes I've gotten nothing but one single kernel of gold out of a 300-page book of garbage.
Mm-hmm.
But it does happen. That's exhausting. I won't lie. It's one of my least favorite parts of research.
It's one of the issues that we have when people's like, can you recommend a good... No, there is no good book to read.
We don't have a good book. It's that's one of the reasons we say read primary sources, because if nothing else...
Those are the best ones.
Yes.
But they're usually boring and dry. So does it meet the qualification of good? Well, it depends on what you mean by good.
Well, and there's still issues within those because
Yeah.
you're still only getting a single viewpoint. It's just you're not going off of the idea this is truth.
Mm-hmm.
But that's one of the things you have to look out for. And actually, this is after doing research long enough into mythology, there are 4 things that are different, not just like mythology to mythology, but within the mythology that you can pretty much throw away. You can disregard it outside of like the
outright,
specific
just
story.
outright disregard. You're going to talk about that.
Yes.
Right. Okay.
Okay. These, for anyone who's doing research,
Pay
these are the
attention. These are the major red flags.
genealogies. Genealogies of the gods change area to area, time period to time period, context to context. A god that is considered primordial in one tradition will
Is
be
a hero in another.
Is hero, so not even a god, like a divine human, like a mortal that was just grand. Like an example would be Achilles. Achilles, depending on where you are, is always been a god, is an ascended god, so a hero who turned into a god by being grand. A hero, or in some cases, he's a spirit. So it's like
Who
which
never
one's-
existed,
Yes.
but was also never a god.
Yes, so he's which one is he? Well, he's Achilles.
Yes.
That's why we say it doesn't fully matter. But then, because that's just how he's seen. Now let's look at genealogies. So like Eros, better known by the Roman name that he was fused into, which is
and
Cupid.
using Greek just simply because it's the most common.
It's the most common. You have, what is it? But you have basically Eros, the god of love, is primordial. He's one of the first deities that existed, and life basically spawns from him conjoining with, I think it's Erebus and Nyx, but I might be mixing those two up. But then there's also versions where he's the son of Aphrodite, which is like 3 or 4 generations down, depending on the tradition, from where he is in another story tradition. And then this is partly why you can't take the
sometimes
genealogies.
his mother's
face value.
Hera. His mother might be who's the goddess that you just mentioned?
Aphrodite.
Aphrodite has got the genealogy doesn't matter unless it's actually pertinent to that particular story.
Yes, like it's like a story of Asclepius's birth. Okay, Apollo is his father in that one because it's relevant to the story. But in reality, Asclepius is an ascended god.
In any other story, it doesn't matter.
Well, it doesn't really matter,
probably
period.
wasn't even a thing.
Probably, because the literary tradition, it's a lot like the actual folklore of Paul Bunyan versus the stories of Paul Bunyan.
Mm-hmm.
So that's just the genealogies. It's why you can't, you can't take how one is set up and
Really
then take
don't
it
pay
somewhere
no
else.
attention to them.
Well, even in the Norse, the different gods will have completely different parentages. Like sometimes Tyr is the son of giants, sometimes he's the son of Odin, and on and on and on. There are stories where like Vidar and Vali aren't born really till Baldur's already dead, and then there's stories where Baldur and Vidar are in the same story. There's the genealogies, the when someone was born is completely and utterly irrelevant.
Mm-hmm.
And really, it's because that's just not how things work. That's one of the 4 things you can just throw right out. Don't take it at face value. It doesn't matter. Really, it doesn't. Number 2, the king of the gods. This is, or leader, because sometimes it's female. I won't lie. Sometimes it's female. Very, not in any of the
King, chieftain, leader,
the-
any of those words. It doesn't matter.
Yeah, well, modern English genders the word king, but it used to
Right.
be gender neutral. Just like chieftain. You didn't used to have chieftain and chiefess, you just had chieftain. But that's the other thing that you can throw right out. It's not that you don't take that into account with the stories you're reading.
Or with that particular story that mentions it directly.
Yes. But really, it changes all the time, region to region, time period to time period. And it's usually actually representative of a political and social climate of the time.
Mm-hmm.
Like, one of the biggest examples of this is actually the Celts, because they don't have a king of the gods. People will usually pick one, but
Well, they have a king of the gods, but it's many kings.
yes, and that's the other thing. It's almost like various chieftains, and then they're not even always in charge.
We do it right. We don't have one king of the gods. We got all of them are kings of the gods.
Well, every king, not every king. Well, yes, every king.
every king. Let's use the word correctly.
Every king or every god, whichever, is a king of someone, is a chieftain of some people.
Morrigan, Queen of the Fae. Is that not you? And to do it correctly, which the title Queen shows its later period, but Queen of the Fae, should actually be King of the Fae. Is that not a king? Especially considering many of the Fae are gods. But then you also have Brez, you have Nuada,
You have the Dogda,
all of these are kings.
Mananan.
Yes, and more. They're all kings, actually. It just depends on which story, which time, where, when, how. Who's telling the damn story?
Well, and you're going to have even though there's a massive overlap of the gods of like the British Isles and the Irish and even the continent, they have various differences one to the other. They're not the exact same because the people aren't going to represent it the same. It's like in Scotland, they're actually notable because they're one of the few places I have found it where the quote-unquote official leader of the gods is female. It's Bera. But then
Unless it's her husband or her brother or her son.
Or.
Yeah.
And that's the thing is you can't really take it at face value. That's the other thing. Third thing, and actually I'll group these together, third and fourth thing. The creator of humans and the creator of the world. These two things change constantly. The myth doesn't even stay consistent, so it's not just swapping out the gods. It changes, and I think it's because it's the through line thing.
Well, let's take the perceived Scandinavian. Ask Nembla. Many of the people in the audience, whether you follow the Norse pantheon or not, I'm sure, or the Eddas or not, I'm sure you've heard the story. Ask Nembla. Odin carving logs, breathing the life into the logs, so on and so forth. Very reminiscent of Adam and Eve. But there's other Scandinavian folklore that talks about the spirits of the people, of humans, being pulled out of the forest, walking out of the forest. It all translates to meaning we come from the forest. The particular story of the creation, but your warning, your red flag is, let's pick a random god. This is just bullshit, but it's important bullshit because it's an example, and I want it to be wrong. The one almost for sure not being credited with such things. Let's say Fenrir. Fenrir, he's out howling at the moon one night, and he's very lonely. So he decides to make some playmates. And with his magical howl, he howls deep into the forest. And he pulled the spirits of man who was asleep within the trees to come forth so that he might play with them. It's a bullshit story, but I am crediting Fenrir with the creation of man.
Well, and that's the thing is, it doesn't really matter.
I mean, it's a nice story, I think, for being made up on the spot.
It is.
Man comes from the forest, so I'm following the theme. Man comes from the forest, and they're called forward. The deity that does it, take that with a huge grain of salt. And it might be a wonderful story. You might like the story, and that's fine to like the story, but do not take that as this is what it was. No.
Well, and if mythology bothers to have a creation story, typical a creation story with people, they actually have groups of people, like tribes. Like Tolkien actually did it right, where he has like groups of elves and like groups of dwarves. And
one of the groups
people,
he borrowed from the Greek, and they sprung forth like flowers. I'm not sure which group it was. It could have been elves or humans. I don't know, but yeah, he did it right. He did it actually in the Hyperborean tradition.
Well, and the thing is which god is attributed? Well, it's either the one that's politically viable because it automatically places them in a very high position, or it's probably the god that is most beloved by the people. Like in Hesh, Frau Halla, a very popular goddess in that area, or
used to be anyways.
It used to be. She is credited with creating man. And here's the interesting thing is in that area, she is a old woman from the front and a tree from the back. Kind of like a moss maiden a little bit. So basically, you got the forest element again. So there is this through line of we're from the forest, but it's being represented in different ways because of the fact that each tribe is going to remember that this is one important element. We come from the forest because it helps us understand who we are, why we do the things we do, why we appreciate the things we do, why when we go to the forest, we're back home, why not to destroy the forest, why to respect the forest, and all these things that we actually find very, very valuable. I mean, most
right. The point of the story. The who is less important.
Well, it's odd because with gods, we always say the who is very important. But with events, it's a little less important. And then the fourth thing, the creation of the world, it's because that story changes all over the place. It's usually symbolic, is the way I describe it at best. Like the famous one from Iceland. Muspelheim and Niflheim and the
It's
dew.
a beautiful story.
Yes, it's also from a volcanic island where hot lava constantly spews out magma. Yeah,
Magma.
actually, when it's underground, it's called magma. You know, that whole thing. So you have the lava coming out, magma, whichever, and basically when it hits the cool air, when it hits the
land
water,
of steam.
Yes.
Niflheim, the land of steam.
the land
or
of
mist.
Yes, you
It's
get
both.
land. It's actually for Iceland a very smart way to represent the creation of a landmass. It's also why Surtur is so important in Iceland because he's the god of the volcano there.
Right, and it creates the land. And then the Celts have their version with the giant. The Scots have a version with another giant. There's another version in Scandinavia folklore. She created the oceans between the land masses and several islands, and these stories are everywhere. And they're different stories, and they're wonderful stories. It's not don't dismiss the stories, or we're not saying dismiss the stories, but don't write them down or don't take them as this is the only story and this is the true story and
Well,
proof of the superiority of Bera.
Well, let's actually take a note from the Christians, oddly enough, because the Christians, for all their faults, were very good at recognizing when something was pagan, because they usually wanted to ixnay that. They have described folklore and fairy tales as the pagan Bible. Notice that they call the folklore and fairy tales the pagan Bible. They don't call the Eddas. They don't call the Tane or the Book of Invasions the pagan Bible.
Or any particular book.
No, just the folklore and the fairy tales, period. Across the board, all of them. Whether it's collected in a collection like...
well, and now take into consideration, they had control over what was printed, what was bound.
Oh, yeah, that's what I was...
And they still allowed some of these books to be printed.
Oh, yeah, there's a lot of examples of people, like we said with Jacob Grimm. He was charged with heresy. He had stories of the gods. He couldn't print them. I'm surprised he got away with giving...
And yet they still allowed him to write some of them. It doesn't mean that those aren't valid. No, it means that they allowed this group of stories to be written, placed together in a book, because it actually depowered them, made them more in line with the Holy Bible.
Yes, and that's the thing is I'm actually surprised that I've read multiple versions of Grimm's fairy tales, and I'm surprised Mother Hala got in there because it's a pretty blatant goddess. I'm surprised they let her in there.
They probably didn't realize it. He probably snuck her in.
Probably. But and it's probably because they didn't quite know who she was.
And I respect the living fuck out of the Grimm brothers, but that what is their it's basically a tome. It's 4 books. What's that called?
Teutonic mythology.
Yes. It's not a fucking Bible.
No, there's a lot of
They
elements.
make a lot of assumptive errors.
They make
straight out the gate.
Well, they make a lot of good points and they make a lot of really bad points, and I can't.
Their points really aren't worth reading. What's worth reading is the stories that they reference.
That's actually true, because I've read most of Teutonic mythology. They have a lot of references to stories, customs, things that are valuable. And if you can read German as well, especially the dialect they spoke in, which I know is rare because the language has been royally fucked.
If they're speaking to you, seek medical attention immediately.
But well, you see, the Grimm brothers speak to me from beyond the grave, and I must that whole thing.
Yes.
But no, it's those. There are so many stories, So many stories, and I love our folklore. I love our fairy tales, even the stuff that's been fucked with.
Mm-hmm.
But it's been fucked with. That's the thing we have to start with.
Well, and here's another thing. Like, we used opinions as a red flag, right? Opinions can be interesting to read. I've read some stuff. It was almost all opinion, but it was interesting opinion. I didn't agree with all of the opinion that was written, but it was interesting opinion. But I understood one thing that a lot of people right now struggle with. I knew it was opinion, and I read it as opinion.
Well, and here's the thing is, like, just an example of how opinion can be interesting. Philosophy. Mm-hmm. Philosophy is an entire genre of opinion.
Yeah.
Which is why some
100% across the board from beginning to end, philosophy is opinion. The opinion of Marcus Aurelius, the opinion of Plato,
the opinion of Voltaire, the opinion of pick a philosopher.
Julio Kaiser.
Yes.
I don't know why. I just love saying his name that way. It's probably actually closer to how it was said.
Quite possibly. And yeah, there's so many wonderful things in our folklore, and it's why I always get excited when people ask about it. But there's also the element of there are all these pitfalls. They are designed to make you actually. We've had multiple people, especially you, who have admitted to us that they read the Eddas and then they went back to Christianity because the Eddas proved Christianity.
Well, as a matter of fact, YouTube, it probably still is, full of videos talking about how they left Christianity. I grew up a Baptist or not a pedestrian.
A Presbyterian?
Yes.
Or something like that?
Yeah, there we go. Presbyterian, whatever the denomination was, whichever cult of Christianity it was. And they're like, and then I started pursuing ethnic religion because I wanted to get closer to the roots. And I did all this study, and I read everything, and I started doing comparisons, and it led me back to Catholicism. That's why the books are one, depending on the age, were allowed to exist. The other, why they're arranged in the way that they're arranged. It's to mimic this, to lead you back to these conclusions that Catholicism is right.
Well, and they didn't have to just overly fuck with things. They just had to tweak things
just
here.
Enough.
Well, it's like the Prose Edda quite literally starts with, and you actually were handed the Prose Edda as a kid, and you were like, this is a Christian book.
Yeah, why did you hand this to me?
Because it literally starts with the Bible be right, yo.
Yeah.
And then the first big story, which I think is Gilfagoning, at least
and that wasn't literally paraphrased.
But it effectively starts with that.
The Bible be right, yo.
But the first big story or group of stories, Gilfagoning, in the Prose Edda, at least the version I have, actually at the end of that section, the gods basically are like, oh, we played such a good trick on these mortals. Now, which one of us should be Thor and which one of us should be Odin? And then they started picking names.
One of the issues is, like, also, I guess, here's another one, the multiple name fallacy. It's not that some of the guys didn't have multiple names or nicknames. I mean, shit, we do.
Oh, yeah.
Not just you and me, but everybody listening. We all have multiple names. We have our first name, our middle name, depending on which country we're from, our surname and our surname. Again,
and our other surname.
Depending on which country we're from.
Oh, like the Spaniards. They got like 12 last names.
And yet, everybody calls you Tank. So here's another name. But not everybody calls you Tank, because some of the people from when you was a little kid might call you Fish. And why do they call you Fish? Because you liked fish sticks. It doesn't matter. So yes, many of the gods do have multiple names. Usually they're epithets.
Well, and then the issue that people have is then they use that as an excuse that another god is the same as that god because they have multiple names.
Well, like if my nickname was Fish because I liked fish sticks, and your nickname was Fish because you like to go fishing, does that make both fishes the same person? Obviously, the answer is no. At least this should be obvious. I think our voices are different enough. So you can't necessarily go by the epithets either. And it's not confusing. It really isn't. It's not as confusing and intimidating as people think. But realize, and you said this earlier, these are our ancestors. Take into consideration where the stories are from when they might have been told or written down, because we're reading them, that we don't have bards singing them to us from, the early Middle Ages. So take these things into consideration and enjoy the damn story. It's not a freaking Bible. It's not a holy text. It's a holy text, but it's not a holy text. One of the reason why I bring that up is because people will quote, like, one of the foundations of Odin, the All-Father, the Father of all, and all the other gods are aspects
or whatever.
Aspects of himself, as he divided himself up in the very Hindu-y way. The list of 200 names. They know Yorgi, the world serpent, and I'm not even going to try and say his whole name because I always say it backwards. But the world serpent is one of his names. He is also Fenrir. He is also Thor. He is also Bragi. He is also, and not necessarily because they use the name. Sometimes they do. So, like, I believe Bragi is actually one of his other names in that list of 200 names, 200 plus names.
Oh yeah,
sometimes it's the other god's epithets. Or
if you look at his list
gods.
of names and you take it as every figure with this name is Odin, the very first story, like I just mentioned,
my favorite one.
Yes, where it's Odin talking to Odin about Odin, but Odin needs to know about Odin, so Odin calls over other Odin and other Odin.
I like the way I tell it better. Odin wants to know about Odin.
So
Odin goes to Odin to ask Odin about Odin.
But Odin doesn't know enough about Odin, so Odin goes and gets 2 more Odins.
He calls his brothers Odin and Odin so that they can discuss Odin, so that they can describe Odin to Odin. And if you use all the names in that list of names for Odin and then replace every one of the character names with the name Odin, that's the story that you end up with. Odin wants to know about Odin, so Odin goes to Odin in Odin's hall. But Odin doesn't know everything about Odin. So Odin calls his brothers Odin and Odin so that they might describe Odin or discuss Odin, because Odin doesn't remember everything about Odin. Which is why he has to talk to his brothers, Odin and Odin, so that they can figure out who Odin is, so that they can describe Odin to Odin, so that Odin can share his story with the people.
Yes.
What the fuck?
Well, and here's the thing is, we've had a lot of interactions with people online and in day-to-day life, and it's actually one of the things we've noticed is
face-to-face, most people realize when they do, because I've met people face-to-face that take that silly stuff like that at face value, and they run with it, and here's my problem with it. They preach it. But then they meet me face to face.
And they have a conversation and they realize, oh, yeah.
Yeah, they realize themselves just by the expression on my face just how stupid the thing is that they're saying, and that it was a mistake for them to take it literally.
Well, and the other issue
why is there this particular list of names?
Well, it's like common sense isn't so common anymore. It's actually something... You'd be surprised how much
like my
bullshit
dog,
you can avoid.
He died.
Yes. Well, you'd be surprised how much just taking a little bit of common sense can get you through the bullshit. Like, we had a friend who was talking about, I think this was something from someone on YouTube that he got. But basically the taking the antler. This is what Cernunnos represents. You take the antler and you dig into the grave so that you can ceremoniously rob the grave or something like that. And I'm like, why would you? Okay, even if you were going to dig into your ancestor's grave, which did happen, because it's like
that's kind of what they're for.
Yeah, that's what you put belongings in there for. Is it's if your family needs it down the line. Hopefully they don't, but if they do, it's a little nest egg. Your hands would work better. A stick would work better. A sharp rock
would work better than a deer antler.
Yes, I mean, if you were going to use any part of the deer, I would assume either the hoof, because they'll dig with the hoof. So just like have, a severed frickin' deer leg, or the skull itself, because at least you can shovel stuff with it. It wouldn't work very well, but it does a thing.
He got very angry for a moment, and then he got over it, and he was like, oh, yeah, that was pretty dumb.
Yes. And it's like, this happens a lot with us, actually, is someone will be talking to us, and we'll be like, wait, think about it from this perspective. And then they have a deer in the headlights look for a little bit. And then they clearly think about it, and they're like, fuck, you're right. Mm-hmm. Like, you just were talking to somebody who's really into Vikings.
Yeah.
And he was going on about Odin, and then you're like, well, the reason that the Vikings venerated Othin, because you specifically...
Yeah, I described the D, which he was aware of. The funny D actually makes a TH sound, which makes it Othin. But Othin, the Beggar King, and he's like, oh, shit, that makes so much sense.
Because the Vikings are shouting Othin, but the Vikings aren't warriors. They're pirates.
Desperate.
They're raiders.
They're pirates.
Well, and just like most pirates and raiders, the people that usually go do it are usually desperate. They're desperate.
They're not going pirate because everything's going just swimmingly.
No.
It's a dangerous profession at the very least.
Yes, and you might be backed by someone of the higher status.
Yeah, you know, much like, think in governmental terms. Because governments actually did this and still do this. They do it. And it's shit, just like it sounds like. But they will, they want this thing done that they themselves cannot do because it's going to disrupt their enemy or give them more power, or they just want to, whatever the reasoning is. And they're like, okay, these people, they're desperate and they're willing to go do this thing, but it can't be in an official sense because it'll start a war. But they need equipment. Okay, this is what I'll do. I will, quote unquote, sell them
stuff.
The armaments and the weapons and the ships, and then they go do the thing, and then they pay me back for it.
Well, there's also...
this is currently going on all around the world right now, where selling arms to this country or that country because they're going to pay us back. We aren't actually involved.
Or privateers is another historical example of this. But that's one of the things that it makes a lot of things make sense the moment you realize what the Vikings actually were. It doesn't actually require you to be like, well, you see, they didn't venerate Othin. We never argue that. No, we
argued that they did quite often venerate Othin.
But they didn't. But the vantage point people are looking at it from is incorrect.
Yeah. They're looking at it from All-Father Yahweh figure. We're saying, no, the Beggar King, the Raider, the thief.
When you can find depictions of Asgard that's literally heaven in the clouds.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I was discussing it like Odin's Hall, Valhalla. I doubt that was named, but okay, let's run on the assumption they actually did bother naming it, because I'm more familiar with the Celtic way of doing things. The halls aren't named. But let's say that they did actually name the hall. And they named Othin's Hall Valhalla. Okay, now take into consideration who his favorite people are. He is the god of the hanged man. The hanged man, who are the people that get hanged? Okay, now take all of these people and put them in a building and turn up the music, because there's musicians there too. Crank up the music, get the booze flowing, get the drugs going, and just let them go. There's going to be fights, and there's going to be
deaths and parties
all kinds
and
of stuff.
feasts.
And then at night, they get together and have a feast. I'm not changing anything about Valhalla, and I don't think that they did. I think what they did was change the perspective that you look at it. I'm looking at it as a cup that holds liquid. They're looking at it as a cup put away in a shelf.
Well, and actually, Valhalla is part of a larger trend that seems to happen, especially when either Empire...
They need heaven. They need a reward.
They need a reward. So, like, in the Greek...
And they also need punishment.
Yes.
Thus, hell changed.
Yes. Well, the same thing happened in the Greek. Hades became more and more about torment, even though it wasn't originally. And Elysium, which was originally basically the meadow of the ancestors, increasingly became this... specifically, like Valhalla, a place for heroes to go. And what it is it
became heaven.
Yes, it becomes this way of getting people to be willing to die for the Empire, is to give them this idea of, if you die on the battlefield, you get to go to this place, but everybody else is going to go to this horrible place.
You have to die bravely, and there's set conditions on it, like you have to die bravely in battle defending, like, so you can't just go out to battle and die. No, you have to die bravely. You have to die fighting.
Well, and a lot of it actually comes down to, with Greece, it seems to have been a symptom of empire, because empire usually likes the carrot and the stick method. But a lot of European groups and tribes were heavily militarized because they were constantly in war with Christianity. The same thing happened in the Baltic. I don't know if they have the afterlife that way, but it's also why certain gods became really, really prominent in the North, because I'm sure everybody's noticed that by the time the church rolls around, the gods that tend to be emphasized were war gods. There was a reason for that.
Well, and here's another thing. A later period, and this does go with the red flags, by the way, so just kind of helping you see how to kind of navigate through the red flags. In the older stories, and with enough practice, you learn to tell the older ones from the newer ones. You learned how to do it. I learned how to do it. You read enough lore, you begin being able to parse out which ones are older, which ones are newer. Doesn't devalue either one or make one more valuable than the other. But in the older stories, older Hyperborean stories, not everyone gets an afterlife. Some people just die, and that's it. Other people die, and then they do get an afterlife, and typically, a lot of them will have something like the Medal of the Ancestors, where if you do get an afterlife, everybody goes there, and then from there you might be invited, because even in Greece it was this way. You'd go to Elysium. If you had an afterlife, you'd go to Elysium, and then Zeus or Hades or Poseidon might come to Elysium because they heard of your grand escapades and invite you into their hall, into their home, into their house. There's different wordings. But in later periods, when you get the heaven-hell dichotomy, everyone has an afterlife, regardless. And either you go to the good place or you go to the bad place.
Oh, yeah, it starts becoming a dichotomy. And it's because dichotomies are easy because, like we've discussed this before, there's an us and a them.
Mm-hmm.
That's natural. That's human nature. But the good and evil, that's something that comes later. The good and the bad. Like, there's bad for you, like your tribe, and there's good for your tribe. But these aren't evils or goods in the sense of, like, a grand, greater scheme. But empire thrives on simplicity. It's why it tends to whittle away language. It's why it tends to simplify mythology. It's why, like, in America, for instance, let's go with that. They are trying to remove these broader elements of our culture and even our spirituality because, like, there are figures who have been venerated in the past in the United States and still are, like Columbia, Paul Bunyan, Johnny Appleseed, even Finn McCool and older European gods like.
Well, and they're trying to narrow down the stories and streamline them, and or say that they didn't even have any.
Oh yeah, well, like almost every homegrown American hero cult or local god cult or whatever they're claiming never existed. Like, if you notice, almost every folk hero that's famous in America is classified as either historical and evil or fictional.
And then that turns grandma and grandpa into liars.
Yes.
But grandma and grandpa told me these stories of Paul Bunyan, Puxatawny Phil. Let's roll with him because I just like him today. Grandma and grandpa told me these stories of Puxatawny Phil, but the academics, the historians, the people that know what they're talking about said that these stories didn't exist until 1924. And they're telling me stories that they said that their parents told them of Puxatawny Phil. They're lying to me. Why would my grandparents lie to me? No. That's exactly backwards.
Well, and actually, here's a fun fact. So, Puxatawny Phil is like the oracles of Apollo, because the various prophet groundhogs are the prophets or the seers or whatever, or the oracles of the groundhog, just the groundhog. And there actually is in Pennsylvania Dutch culture, especially at men's lodges, there is the cult of groundhogism. And because of
and that's actually what it's called.
Yes, I'm not even making that up. And here's the fun fact, is Puxatawny Phil's fame got so high, particularly due to Groundhog Day, the movie, but he was relatively famous before then, that they've actually done mock plays where they hang a effigy of Puxatawny Phil because he is distracting from the one true groundhog.
That's awesome.
Yes, so Puxatawny Phil is like it's like the Oracle of Delphi for Apollo.
Mm-hmm.
Like, he is very clearly just he's more famous than the groundhog, but the groundhog is like the groundhog that's in all the groundhogs. He's like a totem animal.
The spirit of the groundhog.
The seer of seers. He is a deity. You can actually see it when you look at pictures of people who are the handlers of the inner circle of Puxatawny Phil.
Mm-hmm.
They are actually treating this groundhog and looking at him with adoration. They absolutely love this freaking groundhog.
Yeah.
It seems silly to some people, but they truly do. And that's the thing is, nobody would try to say, well, you see, the groundhog is actually Apollo or something like that.
Here's another important thing, and you struggled with it for a while. Even I struggled with it for a while. Don't worry about the academics or the academically minded taking you serious, because real academics don't fucking agree with each other on anything.
No,
whenever somebody says academics agree, they're full of shit.
Oh yeah, that's one of the
amateurs agree.
Yes, the reality is, just an example of actually this is twofold: how harshly academics will disagree, and how Christianized our sciences and our research has been for a long time. In the Victorian era, there's a famous situation of a debate. And they're arguing, what did the serpent do before it was forced to crawl on its belly? You know, like the story from the Adam and Eve. And one person argued that it coiled its tail and bounced around. And one person lost their shit and started throwing tables around and screaming, Satan is not a fucking pogo stick!
Right. Well, and the thing is I know what conversation you're talking about. They wasn't even talking about Satan. What they was talking about was the snake and evolution, and it was supposed to be a scientific discussion on evolution. Then it turned into Satan isn't a fucking pogo stick. It's there. It is there. They can't not do it.
Yes, it's their perception of certain things is just colored by this. It's the same reason that all the races have to be the same. That we all have to have come from Adam and Eve.
And it's why the world is sick right now.
Yes, the universalism.
And I talk to a lot of non-whites, and it's amazing the things that we agree on. Like, it doesn't take me but a couple minutes. Like, I talk to other Hyperboreans. I can hear the air suck out of the atmosphere as their anuses pucker up because they're so uncomfortable with the things I'm saying. But oddly, when I talk to non-Hyperboreans, and I'll start talking about universalism and how it is a sickness in the world, and it's making everybody sick, all the people sick, it's killing everyone. They pause for about 3 seconds, and they're like, you know what, you're right.
Well, and they actually get excited when we talk about how we are trying to get our ethnic ways back. Mm-hmm. And here's the odd thing.
And they're oddly supportive of it.
Oh, yeah, they're supportive of it, but this is actually really common. This is what they'll do is they'll take a look at you and they'll be like, not Wiccan, not the Viking thing. You're not talking about that Aryan stuff, are you? And they'll actually be like, I'm looking at you and I can tell you're not one of these odd things I've dealt with before.
Mm-hmm.
And then you basically explain it like, real ethnic stuff.
Right. And doesn't take but... And I think what it is because they're willing to actually have a conversation with me, probably because I'm not one of them. So it's one of those exciting moments. I got to talk to a bear. A real bear was speaking to me. Of course you're going to listen. You're going to be more open to what the bear is saying. And I think that's what it is. So when I say things like follower of ethnic ways, and in my research, I've found that not just us, but every ethnic group starts off with the assumption we are all completely different species.
Oh, yeah. You've had entire conversations with, like, Samoans that are like, oh, thank you. Somebody finally said it.
Yeah.
Because it's like they had to keep their mouth shut the entire time they were in North America, and then they met you and, like, finally.
Right. Or the South Americans, or the Japanese guy that
or
I
the
met,
Chinese,
or the Northern Chinese fella I met.
Or Africans, or all these other things. And all of us have different gods. And this is the thing this is actually one of the things that's really different from ethnic ways versus a universalism. Universalism there's the one true religion.
Mm-hmm.
Ethnic ways these are our gods. Yes, you have your own gods, and they're valid, I guess, but these are our gods. I don't really care about your gods.
Mm-hmm.
It's like myself. I actually believe that the Japanese gods Amaterasu are as real as ours. They're just the Japanese gods.
Yeah.
And I don't know enough about Amaterasu to tell you much about her, other than she seems to be a sun
and even
goddess.
if you did know a lot, it doesn't make Amaterasu one of our gods. So therefore, you don't venerate
Amaterasu.
Amaterasu.
I have gotten so many Christians just flabbergasted when I'm like,
oh
dude,
yeah, it shuts them right up. I know right where you're going with it.
Because I will tell them, oh yeah, I believe in your God. I just believe he's a liar. Well, and actually, I believe his priests are liars.
Right, and then watch they fish mouth.
They're so shocked. It's like I'll tell them, oh yeah, like Jesus is like some kind of solar wizard that builds tables. He's Jewish Merlin.
And he's a hit at parties because all you have to do is have water. He's going to create the wine.
Now, is it good wine? I don't know.
But if you drink enough of it, it doesn't matter.
Oh, that's true of any alcohol.
Exactly.
Except rubbing alcohol.
Well, even then, it doesn't matter for a brief moment in time. And then after that, nothing matters.
Well, and the reason this gets me so, you know, is when I first started looking into the ethnic ways. I was actually really young. I was in high school. And I was looking specifically for the German ways because that was my ancestry. And when I was digging into it, all I found was Viking stuff. And then even when I found like a lead on Germanic stuff, well, it's like Viking stuff, but there's less of it.
Right. Well, and so much of the Viking stuff is misrepresented. It's not that it's wrong, it's misrepresented.
Well, and also there is overlap because this is how gods work more or less. They have ranges, and those ranges are not defined by modern national boundaries. But on the same token, they're not infinite. So, like, there might be a lot of overlap on the northern coast of Germany because there's constant sea trade and constant traffic and conversation about gods. But you get, like, into the mountainous regions, you're going to hit less and less commonality, and that's where I'm descended from. So I don't really have overly connection to most of the Scandinavian gods, which is why in high school, I'm not a Viking. I know I'm not a Viking. So I kind of just put it away and put it as, like, a maybe. Maybe I'll look into this in the future. And then I went to college, and I met, for the first time in my life, Wiccans. And I was done.
Wonderful people.
I was done. I was done after meeting them. I was like, you are some of the most unfortunate, crazy people I've met in my entire life. And I'm not going to pretend that's everybody that labels themselves a Wiccan. But those are the ones I met. And then it took me...
And they come in a spectrum like
every other group. But it took me almost pretty much a decade almost before I started looking at it again.
And yeah, so congratulations. When you noticed something was wrong, you was correct.
Yes, that's the thing I want people to understand is when you're looking at these things and you're like, why the frick did Thor just, punt a fricking dwarf into a fire?
And it might actually be part of the story, but the way that's presented that particular story, and then what somebody's opinion is on that doesn't necessarily mean that much. You need to, what is the perspective that they're coming from? What is the basis of their opinion? Are they a monotheist? Are they
occultist?
Are they an occultist? Are they universalist of some version? Are they starting from the presumption that the gods were actually mortal people? Are they starting from the presumption of they've always been gods and this thing is completely separate from human beings? Are they starting from the perspective of humans feared their gods? Are they starting from the perspective of humans prostrated themselves before the gods? What is their perspective? So this is what's forming their opinion on the story when they give an opinion. Very little of if you go back and listen through our podcasts, we give very little opinion, and most of the time we will even state this is our opinion.
Well, and
otherwise we're backing it up with things. And you could argue, well, that is just opinion. Okay, on that note, then, if you want to make that argument, everything in life in the world is merely an opinion, and therefore, from your perspective, has no value, or it all has value.
Yes, it's equivalent value.
Yeah.
Well, and I have had so many people when they are first trying to look into ethnic ways, because our people want it. They want it. But like we had people talk about how we've actually had multiple people ask us the question, why is Celtic spirituality so effeminate? It's not.
No, it's actually a hyper masculine.
It's
you
hyper.
Look at the lore and customs themselves. It's hyper fucking masculine.
Well, it's hyper aggressive.
Yeah.
Almost everything is a war. Someone dies in every story.
Well, the overall presentation is hyper masculine and very war oriented. Some of it is extremely feminine, and again, war oriented. It's almost all war oriented when you look at the actual stories.
Well, and it's the bias of viewpoint.
Mm-hmm.
Because the reason that Celtic spirituality seems so effeminate is because the primary
well, yeah, that's what I was going to say. It's not actually the Celtic stories. It's the people that's
it's
following them. I say very loosely.
Well, the reality is ethnic ways, it changes person to person, and there is actually. We've discussed this before. There is a masculine side to it, a feminine side to it, so a woman's side and a man's side, and even a children's side.
Mm-hmm.
You're not going to have it done the same way by any of these three.
Well, and then when you have insane feminists pushing the Celtic stuff and twisting everything to the way that they want the world to be and to have always been.
Oh, yeah. Well, like when
Of course, everything's going to turn really hyper feminine and weird and crazy and...
Well, like someone will say, Odin, I've actually seen this. Odin, the best student of the great witch goddess. What?
Yeah, which one? Which witch goddess?
Well, and witch god just means a god of the witch cults, which were just agrarian cults of rural people that didn't even realize they were pagan half the time.
Yeah.
Because it was just how they always did, yo.
Right, and
I got to stop saying
that
yo.
opens up into a whole nother conversation, but we've actually finally reached the hour mark. So, yeah, I hope that we gave you guys some things to think about, highlighted some of the red flags, some of the ways to approach this, things to watch out for, things to consider, and that you just enjoy yourself, enjoy life, and let's be the best people that we can be.
And I will just say, you're not wrong for noticing all these issues throughout the lore. Like, it's almost like it's breadcrumbs designed to lead you back to where you were. This is by design. The trick is to be true to yourself, be true to your people, and you have to think about this stuff. And I know that our audience is the type to do that. Here's the reality of it is by all rights, paganism should not be a ton of academic work. It never should have gotten to this point. But unfortunately, that's where we are, and we have to be the generation to get past it so future generations don't have to be doing this. Lore Keeper out.